I hadn't even shifted the truck in a park before the nightmare started. And looking back on it now, sitting on this same porch with a cold beer in my hand, it still feels like a fever dream that turned into a full-scale tactical operation. My name is Silas, and I'm just a guy who wanted a quiet life in a house with a bit of character, a fixer-upper on a sun-drenched cul-de-sac in a Georgia neighborhood called Stone Creek Ridge. I thought I'd found a sanctuary, a place where I could get some sawdust on my jeans and finally hang my TV exactly where I wanted it. But I didn't into Oppos. T realized that the moment my tires touched that driveway, I was stepping into a war zone presided over by a woman who thought she was the High Queen of the South. I'm talking about Beatrice Vance, the president of the Stone Creek HOA. And let me tell you, this woman didn't in Oppos. T just walk. She marched with a rhinestone-encrusted visor and a clipboard held like a divine shield, her eyes scanning my 26-foot U-Haul like it was a Trojan horse filled with plague rats. She was in my driver's side window before I could even cut the engine, and the first thing I heard was an Oppos. T.A. in quote, "Welcome to the neighborhood," in quote, or A in quote, "Can I help you with a box," in quote, but a sharp, rhythmic tapping on the glass that set my teeth on edge. I rolled it down, trying to keep a smile on my face despite the Georgia heat already starting to cook me in the cab, and I said, in quote, "Hey there, I'm Oppos. I'm Silas, just moving in," quote. But she didn't in Oppos. To even blink, just adjusted those oversized sunglasses and told me I was in violation of Section 4, Paragraph B. I just stared at her for a second, my brain trying to process why a total stranger was quoting bylaws at me while my life was still packed in cardboard. And she went on to explain, in that sickly sweet, condescending tone that makes your skin crawl, that I had an Oppos. T submitted a formal in quote, moving intent notification in quote, 14 days prior, and that my truck was in quote, grossly oversized in quote, for the residential street. I laughed, honestly thinking it was a joke, a bit of hazing for the new guy, and I told her in quote, "Mon Oppos, I'm Oppos. I'm not moving into a 4-bedroom house with a Prius. This is just how it works," in quote. But her lips thinned into a line so tight it practically disappeared. She looked me dead in the eye and said, in quote, "I've already dispatched the authorities, Mr. Bradley, because we maintain a certain standard of decorum here that you've clearly failed to respect," in quote. And then she just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the flashing lights like she'd just called in a domestic terrorist. When the cruiser pulled up 10 minutes later, I was leaning against my truck, more confused than angry, but that changed when the officer stepped out and looked at Beatrice with a face that said, in quote, "Not this again," in quote. She started barking about unauthorized heavy machinery and, in quote, aesthetic disruption, in quote. But I just reached into my glove box and pulled out the one piece of paper I knew would change the game, the deed to the property, which clearly showed a split parcel designation from 40 years ago. See, I'd done my homework before signing that mortgage, and I knew that this specific house, along with 3 others on the edge of the woods, had been grandfathered out of the HOA's jurisdiction when the subdivision was expanded in the 90s. I handed the paper to the officer, a young guy named Miller who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and I watched his eyes track the legal description until he looked up, handed it back to me, and told Beatrice that this wasn't into Oppos. TA police matter because, quite frankly, I wasn't into Oppos. T part of her little kingdom. The look on her face was like she'd just swallowed a whole lemon, a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated venom that told me this wasn't into Oppos. T over, not by a long shot, and as she stormed off toward her custom golf cart, muttering about, in quote, devalued property, in quote, and in quote, legal recourse, in quote, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Over the next few days, the silence of the neighborhood started to feel heavy, like there were eyes behind every curtain, and every time I went out to my driveway to toss some old drywall into the dumpster I'd rented, I could see Beatrice's white sedan idling at the end of the street. Then came the end quote, ransom notes, in quote. Unmarked envelopes slid under my door in the middle of the night, filled with grainy photos of my dumpster and typed warnings in all caps about, in quote, exterior structure violations, in quote, and, in quote, immediate removal orders, end quote. I decided right then that I wasn't into Oppos. T gonna be the guy who just took it, because I've dealt with small-town bullies before, and the only way to stop them is to shine a light so bright they have nowhere to hide. I spent a Saturday installing high-definition 4K cameras, discrete ones, but positioned so they covered every inch of my property line, and it didn't in Oppos. Take 24 hours to catch my first, guest, At 3 a.m., the footage showed Beatrice and a man I'd later find out was her, enforcement chair, a guy named Gary who looked like he'd lost a fight with a lawnmower, walking up to my dumpster and slapping orange, violation, stickers all over it. They were giggling, actually laughing like teenagers, as they took photos of their handiwork, and I just sat there in my dark living room, watching the monitor and thinking, okay, Beatrice, you want a war? I'll give you a war, I took that footage down to the county clerk's office the next morning, not just to complain, but to dig, because I'm a firm believer that if someone is this obsessed with controlling their neighbors and oppos lawns, they're usually hiding something in their own backyard. I met a clerk named Mrs. Higgins who had been there since the Stone Age, and when I mentioned the Stone Creek HOA, her eyebrows went up so high they nearly hit her hairline, and she started pulling files like she'd been waiting for someone to ask. It turns out Stone Creek had been, reevaluating, its dues every 6 months for 5 years, and the budget for, general landscaping and security, had tripled in that time, but the neighborhood didn't end oppos look any better. In fact, the community pool was half drained and the playground was rusted through. I started looking at the vendors, and that's when the first thread started to pull. A company called, Vance and Amp, Sons Environmental, was getting paid $40,000 a year for, consultation services, and another one called, Summit Security, was charging for patrols that clearly only happened when Beatrice wanted to harass someone. I called an old friend of mine, Julian, who's a forensic accountant with a personality like a shark, and I told him I had a feeling the HOA treasury was being treated like a personal piggy bank. While he started crunching the numbers, the harassment at home escalated from petty to psychopathic. I woke up one morning to find a car I didn't in oppos recognized parked halfway across my driveway, and when I knocked on the owner's door 3 houses down, a woman screamed at me through the screen that I was, harassing the board, and that I shouldn't, move back to wherever I came from, The real breaking point, the moment that turned this from a neighborhood squabble into a legal crusade, was when I found a dead hawk, a beautiful protected bird, nailed to my back fence with a note that said, watch your back, I didn't in oppos called the police this time. I called the district attorney's office, and I called the Department of Natural Resources, and I sat there on my porch with a shotgun across my lap, just cleaning it, mind you, but making sure I was visible until the sun went down. Julian called me that night, his voice cracking with excitement, and he told me that Summit Security was and oppos just a security firm. It was a shell company registered to Beatrice's brother-in-law, and the money trail was as messy as a toddler's finger painting. They were laundering the, fines, they collected from residents, fines for, unauthorized flower species, or, mailbox tinting, and funneling them through these fake vendors to pay for Beatrice's Florida vacation home and Gary's new truck. We started going door to door, me and Julian, talking to the neighbors who had been bullied into silence for years, people like the Thompsons who had lost their savings paying, legal fees, to the HOA, and an elderly veteran named Mr. Henderson who was being threatened with foreclosure over a fence he'd built 40 years ago. We didn't in oppos just asked for stories. We asked for receipts, and once the neighborhood realized that the queen, was actually a common thief, the wall of silence crumbled like dry rot. We organized a, community social, on my lawn, since I wasn't in oppos under the HOA, I could have as many people over as I wanted, and as Beatrice watched from her golf cart across the street, fuming and calling her, enforcement, goons, we handed out packets of evidence to over 50 families. That was the beginning of the end, the moment the momentum shifted from fear to fury, and when the grand jury indictments finally came down 3 weeks later, it wasn't in oppos just for the money. The real kicker, the thing that made the news and turned Stone Creek into a cautionary tale, was the, security, audit that found wireless microphones hidden in the rafters of the community clubhouse and even inside the pool house locker rooms. Beatrice hadn't and oppos. T just been stealing our money. She'd been eavesdropping on our lives, recording private conversations to use as leverage against anyone who dared to question her authority. I watched from my porch as the sheriff's deputies walked up her manicured lawn at dawn, the same way she'd marched up to my truck on day one, and I saw her being led away in handcuffs, still wearing those rhinestone sunglasses, screaming about, in quote, community integrity, in quote, until the door of the cruiser slammed shut. The neighborhood changed overnight. The air felt lighter, people started actually talking to each other across their fences, and the, in quote, Vance and Amp, Sons, in quote, signs were torn down and replaced with actual flowers that didn't end oppos. T have to be approved by committee. I finally finished the kitchen, the avocado green is gone, and the reclaimed wood is up, but I still keep the cameras running, not because I'm afraid, but because I want to remember what it took to earn this peace. The HOA is being restructured now, run by people like Mr. Henderson and the Thompsons, and they asked me to join the board, but I just laughed and told them I'm happy right where I am, on the outside looking in. It's funny how a place can feel like a prison one day and a home the next, all because one person decided to stand their ground and say, in quote, not today, in quote. And as I look down the street, I see a new family moving in 3 houses down with a big, bright orange U-Haul. I think I'll walk over there in a minute, maybe bring them a 6-pack and a copy of my deed, and tell them that in this neighborhood, the only thing they need to worry about is whether their grill is hot enough. But it makes me wonder how many other, in quote, Beatrices, in quote, are out there right now, measuring grass height with a ruler while they dip into the community till, and how many people are just taking it because they think they have no choice. Is a, in quote, perfect, in quote, neighborhood worth the price of your privacy and your dignity, or are we just building prettier cages for ourselves? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I know I'm not the only one who's had to throw a tyrant off my land, and honestly, I think it's time we all started looking a little closer at who's actually running the show behind those gated entrances.